This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
You may get a little excited when you shop at Burlington.
Saving so much! Yeah!
Burlington saves you up to 60% off other retailers' prices every day. Will it be the low prices or the great brands? Burlington. Deals? Brands? Wow! I told you so. Styles and selections vary by store.
I'm Dahlia Lithwick, and this is Amicus, Slate's podcast about the courts and the law and the Supreme Court.
It's not just the big headline things, but it's becoming a thoroughly corrupt system where it's not just too big to jail, but it's too big to bother following all the laws that have protected our health and the environment and our rights at work. That's where we're headed.
While this is in no way a show about Donald Trump and Elon Musk and their spectacular matrimonial breakdown this week, complete with public threats and tantrums and whatever the social media equivalent of good old-fashioned table flipping would look like, let's pause to reflect that without the John Roberts Court, we wouldn't have a billionaire who mistakenly believed he bought America last year just because he paid $295 million for it, and who now wants his money back. Come to think of it, without Mitch McConnell and Citizens United, we wouldn't have a President Donald Trump who believes he owns the judiciary simply because rich donors paid for it, and yet these judges won't stay owned. We taped this week's conversation about what money can and cannot buy when it comes to democracy and the law before Musk and Trump showed up screaming at the returns counter. But in a sense, this is the perfect materialization of why selling off the American justice system was the original sin. While chaos and popcorn reign for White House watchers, for those of us who report on the Supreme Court, a couple of themes are in sharp relief this end of term, chief among them immunity and its bedfellow corruption. As Professor Jed Sugarman told Mark Joseph Stern last week, last term's decision in Trump v. United States provided the president with not only a get-out-of-jail-free card, but also a get-out-of-law-free card. This week, we wanted to think about the money that can buy you out of jail or out of the law itself, and the ways a court or a democracy can have a price tag. Whether it was Elon Musk doing away with the agencies that regulate and monitor his companies, or Donald Trump accepting a sky palace from the Qataris, or the big law firms taking deals to avoid the ire of the president, this get out of jail and get out from under the law for millionaires club is open for business. Our guest this week is Michael Podhorzer. He's the former political director of the AFL-CIO, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He's a founder of the Analyst Institute Research Collaborative, and he has this prodigious gift for using data and numbers to explain democratic institutions in decline. Mike also publishes this indispensable Substack that you must subscribe to. It's called Weekend Reading. And Mike was on this show in March of 2023 warning us about what the conservative legal movement was doing to the judiciary. And I re-listened to that episode this week, and it was kind of prescient. So welcome back, Mike.
I'm sorry that it was prescient, and thank you for having me back.
Well, I feel like you have been sounding this alarm for a lot of years now that the Supreme Court was put up on the auction block and then it was sold off to moneyed interests. And a lot of court watchers were like, no, but it's the court and we need the court, and that you were being hyperbolic. So I'd love for you to just sketch out, before we even begin, how that manifests in 2025, where the court almost feels like it's existing in like the shadow of the Trump presidency.
I think that's right. Although I think that thinking about it as something that's put up on the auction block is the kind of thing that makes it seem hyperbolic, right? When you think about it in sort of cartoon villainish kind of way, it seems improbable and dismissible, right? The point that I've argued, and hopefully folks who haven't will go back and read because there's a lot of data here, is that what this Roberts Court represents is the success of a several-decade project to create the whole legal movement that I'm sure everyone listening to this is familiar with because you've done such great reporting on it. But it isn't what it used to be, where Republicans would put, quote, conservative justices on the court. What happened around the 70s and 80s was that in a sort of Powell Memo 2.0, those same players realized that instead of trying to do a better job working the refs, doing a better job filing good briefs or having, the right kind of arguments, they would just hire the refs. And if they could get a majority, they would be able to accomplish their goals, their agenda, that there was no way to accomplish through democratic means. This is a coalition of plutocrats who still were unwilling to accept the constraints of the New Deal, and right-wing religious folks who were unwilling to accept the whole 60s and 70s and accomplishment of equality. But they understood that that agenda was so unpopular that no one could imagine championing it or winning it through Congress. And so the only way to do it was to have a majority on the Supreme Court that was put there to do this. So as silly as it sounds to think about an auction block where the Supreme Court on First Street gets auctioned off, it seems entirely like rational behavior if you're billionaires and you think this should be a different country to put together the resources, the billions of dollars it took to create a legal movement to accomplish it. And that's what is unprecedented. At other times in our history, the court has done terrible things, but almost always it wasn't because those justices were put there to do it. That's the difference.
You wrote an incredibly important piece a few months back that I commended to everyone at the time called "The Courts Will Not Save Us," by way of setting the table a little bit for the conversation we're about to have. Parse out for me why this, what you call the bipartisan acceptance of judicial supremacy and the passivity and the learned helplessness that comes with that, has delivered us into what has been, as you say, a slow-rolling, decades-long constitutional crisis.
Sure. And to do that, I want to use two quotes that I think really capture the question you're talking about. And one of the words you use, judicial supremacy, is the idea that is so baked into everybody's brains that you don't think there's another alternative way to think about the law because it is bipartisan, right? But after the Dred Scott decision, when Lincoln was inaugurated in his first inaugural, he said, if the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decisions of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own ruler. And that really captures to me what's essential here, right? All of the procedure, the Constitution, everything really has to always go back to be checked against the idea that our government has the consent of the governed, that we are actually the sovereign in this nation, right? And that's what he captured there, right? The idea that if something that big can be decided irrevocably without any recourse by the people, we are kidding ourselves if we think we live in a democracy or that our vote matters. And unfortunately, because it's been bipartisan and the elite media all just passively accept what the court says as true, as necessary, we've lost sight of what it means to have a government that has our consent, right? Because when you think about the things the Roberts Court has done, let's let billionaires spend as much money as they want. Let's erase the Voting Rights Act. Let Dobbs, every one of those things. You think about the way they've changed the country since 2008, and not a single vote on any of it was taken in Congress. Not a single vote to do it, right? No president said this is what we should do. And our eyes are so misdirected and trained on what happens in the White House and Congress that we just accept it, right? In fact, they have governed us in that way. And I also find the other quote that is sort of the perfect balance here is what John Roberts actually said on C-SPAN at the beginning of his term. The most important thing for the public to understand is that we are not a political branch of government. They do not elect us. If they do not like what we are doing, it's more or less just too bad. And how that didn't set off alarm bells everywhere, right? And they followed through, and they just keep doing it.
And I wonder if you can affix that to this set of categories you have made about the difference between rule of law and rule by fiat. Because I think we very myopically tend to hyper-focus on the rule of law as though that has some meaning and that it is unerringly a thing that we all have a fixed agreement on. And your point is like, rule by fiat is something entirely different, and we are conflating the two.
Right. And that is, I think, again, the sort of bipartisan failure on broadly people who want an America with freedoms and democracy, right, is this unexamined and uninterrogated idea that some procedure, some received procedure is the only thing that we have to evaluate what's happening against. Now, the distinction I was making, which I think is really important, is what I call sort of hyphenated rule by law, to create a new word, which is what most of the district courts have been doing over the entire Trump term, right? Which is the judges that were not appointed by Trump have been following the law. The judges, for the most, especially the Supreme Court that he appointed, have not. They just make it up as they go to get the outcome they want. And that's what I call rule by fiat. And one of the important things, if you look around the world at countries in the kind of process of either a transition or not that we're in, is that we really rapidly have to develop an exceptional vocabulary, because as long as we talk about elections as if they're always the same, no matter what, right? We can't see that we used to have elections where outside groups didn't spend a majority of the money in every competitive race in the country. In fact, they spent nothing, right? But as long as we just have one word, elections, we end up thinking that we still live in a democracy, in the same kind of democracy, because we get to cast votes every 2 years. And the biggest point here, one really important thing to do is, instead of calling these rule by fiat decisions, the Supreme Court did X, we said the Roberts Court did, right? Because it then pulls out that this is a mission. It is an outcome-oriented result. It is a result of this coup that's been successful. When, as I suspect, they don't go along with what he wants to do on birthright citizenship, it will be all the justices are close, and that is a Supreme Court decision. But when we give those fiat decisions, the imprimatur of being a Supreme Court decision, we're really defeating ourselves in any conversation we're going to have. And it's down the line. We do desperately need a court system that follows the law, but we have to be able to distinguish it from the one that is just making it up as it goes along.
More in a moment with Mike Podharzer. This episode is brought to you by NetSuite. With today's dynamic trade policies and squeezed supply chains, if your business can't adapt in real time, you're in trouble. You need total visibility from global shipments to tariff impacts to real-time cash flow. That's NetSuite by Oracle, your AI-powered business management suite trusted by over 41,000 businesses. NetSuite is the #1 cloud ERP for many reasons. It brings accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one suite. You have one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. And with AI embedded throughout, you can automate a lot of those everyday tasks, letting your teams stay strategic. NetSuite helps you know what's stuck, what's costing you, and how to pivot fast. It's one system, full control. Tame the chaos with NetSuite. If your revenues are at least in the 7 figures, download the free ebook, Navigating Global Trade, 3 Insights for Leaders, at netsuite.com/amicus. That's netsuite.com/amicus.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game, shifting a little money here, a little there, just hoping it all works out? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can be a better budgeter and potentially lower your insurance bill, too. You tell Progressive what you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll help you find options within your budget. Try it today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Men today face immense pressure to perform, to provide, and keep it all together. So it's no wonder that 6 million men in the U.S. suffered from depression every year. It's okay to struggle. Real strength comes from opening up about what you're carrying and doing something about it so you can be at your best for yourself and everyone in your life. With over 35,000 therapists, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, having served over 5 million people globally. It's convenient, too. You can join a session with a therapist at the click of a button, helping you fit therapy into your busy life. Plus, switch therapists at any time. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/amicus. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/amicus. Let's return now to my conversation with Mike Podhorzer. I feel like since Trump 2.0 began, we've had this through line. I'm remembering Simon Sandoval Moshenberg, who represents Kilmar Abrigo Garcia, coming on the show and saying, we conflate law with power. Right? We think those are the same thing. Right. Because the government can do something. We think it's the law. And then, on the show just 2 weeks ago, we had a conversation with Professor Aziz Huq, who was grafting Ernest Frankel's dual state conception onto the present moment and sort of makes this, I think, sort of really interesting descriptive point that we think that as long as the law is ticking along on this normal track for most people, right, parking tickets and, divorce and disputes over property, the second track, this machinery of terror deployed for disfavored minorities, can be ignored, right? And I think one of the things that you're tilting at, and it's why I wanted to talk to you today, is that America has also had a dual state system wherein rich people can just pay their fine and get out from under the legal system. And Donald Trump, to be clear, has been making his home in that second state, certainly since the 1970s. And I wonder if instead of thinking about this the way Professor Huq was, as, competitive authoritarianism or creeping fascism, we're just reverting to another kind of dual state system in which some people are just too rich for the law.
Right. No, I think that again, is not original to Trump. It is just all of these things have been snowballing, right? If you think about it, after Watergate, the reaction of the system was to pass even stronger laws to try to contain the kind of corruption that was going on. And in fact, even during the Reagan administration and Bush administration, H.W. Bush, you had Charles Keating and Michael Milken and others who were caught going to jail, right? Fast forward to 2008 and the housing crisis, and no one goes to jail. Somehow no one was guilty of anything. And this is a big part of why the public's confidence in institutions has just been tanking, because it's obvious to everyone but the people sort of in the bubble that we are now have a class of people who are too big to jail. And it comes out first in some pretty high-profile ways, like I described. But what we're sliding into is, and I think this is where the Wilcox decision and the other actions that are being taken against independent execution of the laws is your workers try to organize a union. Well, you get an NLRB that says, nope, you lost the election, right? You engage in wage theft, you get a DOL that looks the other way, right? And so it's not just the big headline things, but it's becoming a thoroughly corrupt system where it's not just too big to jail, but it's too big to bother following all the laws that have protected our health and the environment and our rights at work, right? That's where we're headed.
And just to clarify, for listeners, the Wilcox decision that you're referencing was the decision from 2 weeks back that I think got a lot of attention because the Supreme Court seemed to have overturned Humphrey's executor on the shadow docket without reasoning and carved out the Fed without reasoning. But what your point is, this actually isn't just a decision about overturning precedent. This is a decision about massive knock-on effects for workers around the country.
Right, right. And all the other agencies that are in that category that had independence, right? It's like, this is just one more example of how over the last century, at punctuated periods, we realize that we have to constrain essentially capitalists. We have to constrain business. And each time something terrible happens, like you get the crash in 29 and such, and you get the Securities and Exchange Commission, right? You get huge environmental catastrophes, and you get the EPA. And piece by piece, there's progress. And each of those independent agencies were created to be independent because it was obvious how open to capture or bribery the people enforcing those laws would be, and what power it would give to an executive if they could dispense favors by selectively enforcing these laws that people sacrifice so much to get on the books in a democratic fashion, right? I'm glad you brought up Humphrey's executor, because that was kind of like really getting to me, is that we only have these conversations in terms of the problem being overturning precedent or what it means in some abstract sense of how we should be governed, rather than any attention to whether we should have independent agencies, right? All of that time that was spent like parsing the original case and everything else should have been devoted to explaining to people broadly what their stakes in the decision were, right? Unless you really paid attention, you would think this was just about, does the president get to decide this, or do we have it, right, in this abstract way? But if they want to call the question on whether we need independent agencies to execute the law, that should be the national conversation.
I think you're saying something really important here, Mike, which is we get so focused in on, I'm thinking of the birthright citizenship case too, where you can make plausible arguments if you want to about originalism and textualism. And then it just seems like it's a coin flip away, right? I don't know. What are they going to decide? There's merit on both sides. And I think your point is we're kind of carrying their water when we cede the ground of, no, actually, this is why we have independent regulatory agencies whose heads can't be removed willy-nilly. And we cede all that ground and then get into a fight about, well, maybe this is not how that statute was crafted. And I think that's a good point. I want to ask you to be a labor guy for one more minute. Because you have talked a lot about how eviscerating unions and the labor movement is really a kind of unseen priority in the Trump administration. And you devoted many, many pages, I think, to explaining what the administration's attacks, not just on government workers, which I think has been quite visible, but private sector workers too. And I wonder if you I know it's an immense amount of material, but give us a sense of what this has looked like.
In a very good way, people like Levitsky and Ziblatt and Tim Snyder and Ruth Ben-Gia and Kim Shelton have really done a good job trying to educate people about what it looks like when an authoritarian tries to consolidate power. And that, to a very great extent, has been useful in shaping our understanding of what they do when they attack the media, what they do when they attack the law firms or the judges, and so on. But what keeps getting left out is right at the top is taking out the labor movement in the country. That famous first they came for quote, unions were third. And you can sort of put together a scorecard. The authoritarian efforts that have been successful, Chile, Brazil, Turkey, Greece, Spain, Myanmar, Egypt, Iran, South Korea, Thailand, Pakistan, Peru, and Nazi Germany, all began with outlawing or suppressing their labor movements. Countries where they've defended themselves against that or come back, some of them are famous, like Solidarity in Poland or the miners in South Africa, but it was also in Spain and Brazil and Korea and Indonesia and Egypt and Sudan, and eventually in Brazil, where Lula, the steelworker, became president, right? And Venezuela, right? The mainstream corporate media basically ghosts the labor movement, ghosts working people. But a vibrant, a robust labor movement is essential because it is a vehicle for institutional collective action. We all get excited by Tahrir Square, where people seem to be coming together to rise up against it, and you still get a dictatorship because it can't last. It can't monitor it. It can't push back against it. But in the United States, to bring it back, I think, in an important way, a big part of why sort of that recently recovered memory of the fascist tendencies in the 30s in the United States didn't happen is because of the creation of the Wagner Act and the labor movement, which was a bulwark against that tendency. It was the way the working people in this country had a voice in our future. And that's why at this moment, I'm really concerned, because each time something is done to ding the labor movement, it's a page 4 story. And people like you and everybody else who's not in a union thinks it's about just, those working people. Right? They don't understand the connection to their own freedoms. They don't understand how an essential part of democracy is collective action.
You had in your recent Substack about the attacks on labor, you noted, and I hadn't really crystallized this until I read it, that when Reagan attacked unions, it was because of, a rush to globalization and to financialization. When Elon Musk and Doge went after unions and labor, it was, a means of transitioning us to AI. It's a very different endgame. And the other thing you flagged is that one reason DOGE targets government workers is that if you can break the government, you can privatize everything.
Right.
And the tech companies have skin in that game, too.
Right. The way in which the media covered tech's sudden romance with Trump as bending the knee has it completely reversed. We're at this moment, which has not gotten enough coverage, where the European Union is really making gains trying to tackle social platform regulation, and we're at the birth of the AI industry. The question will be, will there be regulation or won't there be? Right? When the internet first came out, everybody was techno-optimist and no constraints were put. There were no constraints put on them at all. And look at the toxic mess we have, right? So everybody in that world understood that in these 4 years, the way in which AI would be allowed into our society was going to be decided. That's a massive stake for all those tech companies. And especially once Musk understands that, and Musk sees the way that the Biden administration was really trying to align with the EU to constrain them, this was a no-brainer. That's one part of it. And it also, and again, I don't want to make this is the only reason, but it is another reason why the administration is pivoting away from Europe, right? Because for all of those tech bros, the current EU leadership is sort of the villain. That's why you see Vance talking to the right-wing parties and Musk talking to the right-wing parties, right? Because the right-wing parties are down with, no privacy laws and such. So that's part one. The second part is that, and I'm certainly not predicting this will happen, but you take FAA. If it gets worse, and God forbid there are crashes, whatever, their expectation is the next step would be FAA-X, right? That, well, you see, the government can't do it, so we have to give it to private companies. And that does a couple things. One, it puts all of this further outside the reach of democratic accountability. It continues the trend towards the people in government not even being able to understand what it is they're trying to regulate because they're so dependent on private contractors and putting it out. And AI government is an enormous market for all the investments these companies have made in AI, right? It's, the government as a revenue stream, which has been for the defense industry to this point.
We're going to take a short break.
Comcast is committed to bringing access to the internet to all Americans, including rural communities across the country, like Sussex County, Delaware.
We were being left behind. Everybody around us seemed to have internet, but we did not. High-speed internet is one of those good things that we needed to help us move our farming, our small businesses, our recreation forward.
Learn more about how we're bringing our next-generation network to more people across the country at ComcastCorporation.com/investment in America.
The spirit of innovation is deeply ingrained in America, and Google is helping Americans innovate in ways both big and small. The Air Force Research Laboratory is partnering with Google Cloud using AI to accelerate defense research for air, space, and cyberspace forces. This is a new era of American innovation. Find out more at g.co/American innovation.
Before we get back to my conversation with Mike Podharzer, I wanted to point you toward an episode from my friend Lizzie O'Leary over on What Next, TBD, about something that sent a genuine chill down my spine this week. Peter Thiel's Palantir is planning to build a master database on U.S. citizens. In conversation with Shira Frankel at the New York Times, Lizzie asks, is Palantir building a data big brother? You can find that episode by searching What Next wherever you listen to podcasts. Okay, back to our show. I want to talk for a minute about something else, and maybe it's the hinge between the conversation we started with, which is these people were put on the Roberts Court to do a job, and they've done it, and the rise of the tech bro. And I think that when you and I used to talk about these things, we talked about Leonard Leo and the conservative legal movement, and they believed that they were buying the courts to gift them to, the Koch brothers and Harlan Crow. But here we have, parachuting in Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin. These are not, they're not only not your dad's oligarchs, they're like not the oligarchs from 3 years ago when we started talking about this. And I think part of what is really complicated is, and you've just sort of flicked at it, but I'd love for you to amplify it. That project isn't just to pollute and end regulation. That project is global and it's vast and it's irreversible.
Well, I hope it's not irreversible, but it's not going to be easy to reverse. I'll come back to it, but I'm not even sure reverse is a helpful way to think about it. Yeah, I think that if listeners aren't aware, Charles Koch was to the very end a supporter of Nikki Haley because of how much they didn't want Trump to be president. And they continued to be dissatisfied. And we've more recently seen about Leonard Leo. They feel aggrieved because it was all their work to take down all of the guardrails against a runaway executive, and someone else is reaping the benefit. They had a very different picture of what happened when they got to the mountaintop, and that this is what's happened. But that's, again, why I think it's important not to try to think about it in the kind of cartoonish way, right? If we understand, even though we don't get reporting about it, that there are contests within the oligarchs or whatever we want to call it, and that they often go up against each other, right, on these things, right? So it isn't all predetermined they win or which ones of them win, but we have to be aware of it. And the reason I said maybe reversing it isn't the right way to think about it is there's a great quote from before the last time we were in the world was in this place when you had the rise of Soviet totalitarianism, you had the rise of the Nazis, the Italian fascists, you had United States, socialist, fascist, all of this sort of bubbling. And then you get the Depression. And the quote was, "The old world is dying, the new world is yet to be born, and the interim monsters," right? That feels very real today. And so the important point is that in the 30s, the new world that was born was the New Deal. It wasn't reversing those things. It was something new. It was realizing that our responsibility is not to try to claw back to the great world we lived in 2 years ago or something, which unfortunately seems to be where the Democrats are. It's to understand that in this moment, we need a new vision. We need a new rebalancing of power between all of us and the few of them, right? And it actually happened within a century ago, right? We had the same thing, massive inequality of wealth, massive sort of rise of fascism. And in the United States, we actually pulled it off. And we pulled it off because there was a willingness for power sharing with working people, right? And that is creating a labor movement. It wasn't, from on high saying we'll give you better wages. It's saying we're going to give you the tools to be powerful participants in the democracy. And that sort of economic and political qualities necessary to have a democracy. And we have to figure out how to do it again.
One of the things that I always come back to in your writing is that, most Americans don't like MAGA. They don't care for Doge. While Doge was never a real government entity, it's certainly a toxic brand. Americans are not looking forward to a measles epidemic or plane crashes or not having FEMA in hurricane season. But as you keep saying over and over again, the levers of power have just been taken over by moneyed interests and by minority moneyed interest. And I guess my question is, what is the hope you want to articulate for sort of clawing back these institutions so that they are not, by design, choking off the public will? It's going to require not spectating. What do we call that, and what does it look like?
So in the next minute, I'm going to solve the whole thing. No, I'm just kidding.
Yes, you've got 30 seconds.
I have 30 seconds to save the world. No, that's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen, right, for a very important reason. And why I don't like this question, except it gives me a chance to say this, right, is that if someone thinks they can answer that question, they're part of the problem. If you think, because it really requires not just our doing something, but an act of collective reimagination. If you think about 1775, many of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence still were trying to figure out how to make it work with Britain and the Parliament. And at some moment, collectively, they all thought, that is just never going to happen. We have to think of something else. And that's America, right? It isn't someone on the sidelines thinking, here's a plan. It's all of us just not accepting this and waking up and thinking we're going to do something different, that there isn't a way to reform our way back to something that's a little better. And that we start giving more oxygen to thinking about how to get to a better place, right? Not how to win the midterms. That we have to think not about how do we make the next argument on a case, but how do we reimagine the way the law expresses the relations of power we want? And that's not Mike, it's not you, it's our collectively understanding we have to do something else.
I actually love that answer because it dovetails so neatly with the very last question I want to ask. We are now in June, and for all the reasons that you hate it and I hate it, the world is gearing up to watch, the closing days and hours of the Supreme Court, and they're reverting to all the behaviors that drive you and me absolutely insane. They are going to call it the Supreme Court instead of, as you noted, your preferred Roberts Court. And they're going to import all their hopes and dreams into good John Roberts or good Amy Coney Barrett showing up to save the rule of law, right? And then cable news is going to report this as the law. And then we're going to pop popcorn and speculate about whether Amy Coney Barrett is good or bad. For folks who've been listening for the last couple of minutes, you're very careful about the language that you use and that I use. What is the language of truth-telling that would, if you were going to advise those of us who are both reporting on the court in the coming weeks and listening to reporting on the court, how is the best way to think about these closing weeks of the term using the sort of schemas you've just laid out and the language you've laid out in a way that is useful as opposed to sort of accruing more harm?
I think the most important thing is reporting any decision that doesn't have Kagan, Sotomayor, or Jackson on it as a Roberts Court decision. And instead of explaining it in terms of precedents, explain it in terms of the interests. That what does it reflect? Because we know that the more extreme the religious cases and the Dobbs is reflecting the Leo and white Christian nationalist portion of that coalition. We know that ACA and Moore v. Harper are reflecting more the mainstream business part of that coalition. They are not representing different legal theories. Right? They are reflecting the different interests that are represented on the court. and that less attention's paid to the precedents and more to the impacts, and to sort of stop abstracting the actual gains and losses that come out of these decisions. And one of the problems I think that the media has, and this is much more than legal correspondence, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there was about 40 years ago, there's this essay called In the Context of No Context, which imagined how the media was evolving to being incapable of explaining anything that was happening today in terms of all the things that happened yesterday, which actually, as someone who was alive back then, was something that actually people did. But the media has this intense recency bias that the only reason B could have happened is whatever we saw yesterday from A. I don't know anyone who talked about the 2024 election and Musk spending so much money as being only possible because of a 5-4 decision by the Roberts Court to let that happen. That should always be part of it. Every time something happens in the world that wouldn't have happened without those decisions, that has to be brought back. So that's really, and to talk prospectively about what this means, especially on our friend Humphrey and his executor and what that actually means. It's not just about executive versus Congress power grab. It's corporate versus you.
Mike Podharzer is not a lawyer, but he always kind of brings me back to a much more realistic and less captive place in terms of how to think about the courts and the law and democracy itself. He is the former political director of the AFL-CIO. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and he's a founder of the Analyst Institute Research Collaborative. He writes a Substack that you must all subscribe to. It's called Weekend Reading. And Mike, I really want to thank you for ushering in Supreme Court season here on the show, because it is really, really just an immensely useful exercise to think very, very critically right now about what the court is not and what it can be. So thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
That's all for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you so very much for your letters and your questions and your thoughts. You can always keep in touch at amicus@slate.com, or you can find us at facebook.com/Amicus Podcast. Amicus Plusketeers, if you haven't already, check out this week's bonus episode for Slate Plus subscribers. Mark Joseph Stern and I broke down a bumper crop of decisions on Thursday in some big cases about guns, separation of church and state, and workplace discrimination. Opinion Palooza is in full swing, so we are releasing bonus episodes when the biggest decisions come down. Subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Amicus show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or visit slate.com/Amicus Plus to get access wherever you listen. And you can stay up to date with the latest coverage of the courts and the law straight to your inbox. Sign up for Slate's Legal Brief at slate.com/Legal Brief, delivered every Tuesday. Sarah Birmingham is Amicus's senior producer. Our producer is Patrick Fort. Hillary Fry is Slate's editor-in-chief. Susan Matthews is executive editor. Mia Lobel is executive producer of Slate Podcasts. And Ben Richmond is our senior director of operations. We'll be back with another episode of Amicus next week. Until then, take good care.